This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, across Bloomberg platforms, radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. Yes, indeed, this is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec on this Tuesday, March 17th, 2026. Yes, indeed, it is.
Happy St. Patrick's Day, I thought you were going to say.
Happy almost Fed decision. We get that tomorrow.
Did you see the press pool at the White House today? Some of them were very festively dressed.
A lot of green?
Yeah, I felt a little... like I wasn't dressed for the day.
This is what also makes a city like New York a lot of fun. As I walked to work, came up from 42nd Street, a bunch of folks in kilts and bagpipes and getting ready. Oh,
you had a much better commute than I did. I didn't notice any of that stuff.
I took a little pictures, but I was very discreet.
I was underground. I was underground the whole time. Hey, not underground. The Federal Reserve kicking off that 2-day policy meeting. Stocks are higher. What do you think they're talking about in Washington right now at the Fed? Oil prices?
I think so. Inflation.
Yeah.
How do they think about that longer term, right? And this is everything that we are trying to figure out what it means longer term. We do have U.S. stocks somewhat higher. You've got, I'm looking at WTI crude off its highs of the session. It was up as much as 5%, still up about 2.5%. So we're watching that trade. I think, again, Tim, it goes back to we're worried about how long this war lasts. What does it mean longer term in terms of the region and the impact on global energy supplies and also on prices? We worry about inflation.
Hey, one thing we're going to be focused on today is the view from Israel on the ground. We ask what the mission is of the country, the view on Iran, and what it wants to be post-war. A lot of questions we're going to get to with Dan Williams a little later.
Yeah, and as you said, on Iran, too, it's like the question of what do they want longer term? What do the people of Iran want? So that is something we're going to tackle. Add it all up as we kicked off our broadcast. We're going to talk about global energy prices and the markets. Dr. Ellen Wald back with us, author of Saudi Inc. I keep thinking about the region and its role in global energy markets. So curious what she has to say about the reality of oil and energy in today's world.
And there's an oasis of calm as the U.S. war in Iran jolts markets, at least when it comes to markets. Yeah. Look, Bitcoin. And we're going to talk about it, why Mastercard is charging ahead, too, on cryptocurrency.
I looked at Bitcoin year to date versus like the S&P 500. Some big outperformance.
For now.
Exactly. Is it fundamentally based? What does it mean? A lot to get into. First up, though, let's get a check on the trade. Let's toss things over to Charlie Fell.
All right, thank you very much. Bitcoin right now, by the way, up by about 0.3%, 74,479 on Bitcoin. Cannot wait to hear Ellen Wald's comments on oil. That's where I'm going to begin with West Texas. Intermediate crude was trading back above $96 last hour. Right now, $95.69 on WTI, showing a gain now of 2.3%. Brent is above 103. Barrel of Brent, the global benchmark, 103.04 right now, up by about 2.8%. Bottom line here, stocks are staging a cautious advance. The S&P's up 25, up by about 0.4%. The Dow up 113, up 0.2. NASDAQ up 122, up by about 0.5%. The VIX just above 22 right now with its 10-year. The Fed meeting underway, 4.19%. The 2-year ahead of tomorrow's decision, 3.66%. Gold, lower a little change, down under 0.1%, but holding above 5,000 at 5,003 the ounce. Crude, West Texas Intermediate up 2.2%, 95.50 for a barrel of WTI. We do have airline shares advancing today. Some executives are citing strong bookings as travelers rush to lock in fares ahead of a potential rise in fuel costs. Case in point, Delta is surging almost 7%. American Airlines up 3.8%, and Southwest among some of the airline names up now by 2.9%. So again, recapping, West Texas Intermediate crude, 95.58 a barrel, S&P up 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it, Charlie. Thank you so much. Well, Israel said it killed Iran's security chief, that in an overnight attack, intensifying a region-wide war that shows no signs of abating, and we are well into our third week. President Trump earlier today from the Oval Office referred to that action. He also talked more broadly about the U.S. war in Iran, including timing. He talked around noon Wall Street time today.
We're not ready to leave yet, but we'll be leaving in the near future. We'll be leaving in pretty much the very near future. But right now they've been decimated from every standpoint. And again, we've had great support from countries in the Middle East, great support, but we've had essentially no support from NATO.
And that, of course, is President Trump earlier today from the Oval Office. With more on what's going on, we want to head first of all to Jerusalem and to Bloomberg News Jerusalem journalist. He is Dan Williams, where it is later there, of course, in Israel. Dan, good to have you here with us. Glad we could check in with you. Glad to see you are still safe. There's so much going on. What do we know about the security chief in Iran that was said to be taken out?
I think it would be fair to say that he was the de facto, at least publicly available ruler of Iran after Israel and the United States in the early hours of this war on February 28th killed the supreme leader, Khamenei. As everyone knows, Khamenei was officially succeeded by his son, Mojtaba, but that man has not been seen in public. He is rumored to have been injured in an Israeli strike or a U.S. strike, and indeed, Trump, the U.S. president, has even speculated that he might not be alive. By contrast, Ali Larijani, a veteran member of the national security echelon in Iran, was available for interviews. He made televised statements, and he even marched in an annual parade or an annual march on Friday in Tehran as a sign of his defiance. It's possible that as a result of that public appearance, he enabled the Israelis to tag him and track him and ultimately kill him overnight.
Dan, obviously it sends a message to the way that Israel and the U.S. view the leaders as they are right now. But I'm wondering, with the killings of the top brass in Iran, who is left to actually be the leader of the country?
Well, if you ask the Israeli or U.S. leaders about this, that would be the Iranian people, the Iranian public. They said at the outset of this war that the secondary objective, the initial objective, was to degrade, destroy Iranian capabilities, namely ballistic missiles, what remains or remained of the nuclear program, and in the case of the U.S., also the Iranian Navy, in order to enable maritime traffic free of Iranian harassment in the Gulf. A secondary role or a secondary objective was to create a space, as they put it, for the Iranian people to take over control of that country. Israel assesses that 70 to 80% of the Iranian populace oppose this regime or have opposed this regime. And while that is hard to assess objectively, certainly from outside, just 2 months ago, we saw protests sweeping Iran and a very brutal crackdown by the Iranian state. So the official line is that the allies are seeking to destroy that regime and embolden to the extent possible, or create the conditions to the extent possible that will enable protesters to come back into the streets and actually give that regime the final push required to topple it and replace it.
Dan, we're going to talk more about Iran in a segment right after you. What I want to ask you, though, about in terms of Israel, the foreign minister earlier said the war is effectively, quote, already won, but vowed to, quote, continue till the point the mission will be completed. What exactly is Israel's mission? And I got to ask you, when we talk about backing and what people and citizens want, what do the people of Israel want? Are they still backing their prime minister? Will they still back him after all of these conflicts are over?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think while the allies, at least at the level of their leaderships, their militaries are very much in sync about the objectives here, they say they speak repeatedly. And in fact, the U.S. military has compared or described the Israeli Air Force as a peer Air Force to the U.S. air assets being brought into the region. Quite an extraordinary statement for the U.S. power, this dominant power in the world, to be speaking about what is basically a regional power in the form of Israel. Nevertheless, the Israeli public, to judge by polls, unlike the American public, are broadly in support of this war. This war has not found popularity among the Americans. There's a very good reason for this. One is geographical distance. Americans are on the other side of the world. Israelis are in the region, feel directly threatened by Iran, not just by its statements, but its actions, including the support of proxies such as Hamas, which Israel has been battling for 2.5 years, albeit in a state of ceasefire ceasefire right now in Gaza, a fairly fragile ceasefire, but a ceasefire nonetheless. Hezbollah in Lebanon, where there has been an eruption of violence. There have been also Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and in the past in Syria and currently in Yemen as well. So the Israelis would appear to be seeing this as the crowning battle or the last war of this multi-front campaign that's really in its third year now.
Dan, 30 seconds, but do the people of Israel still back their prime minister? Who was on...
That's hard.
Yeah, go ahead.
His approval ratings have improved given his conduct of recent policy issues, I believe, including this war. There is an election later this year. I think that's the ultimate plebiscite because no matter his successes, and there have been successes regionally on the battlefield, they will remember the October 7th attack, which began this multi-front campaign, a disastrous attack for Israel, which happened on his watch.
Dan, so appreciate it. Please stay safe. Please be well. Bloomberg News, Jerusalem journalist, of course, there in Jerusalem, in Israel. All right, so that is our view from Israel. Let's get to a view on Iran.
Back with us, Alice Vatanka, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in Iran. He's also senior fellow of Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School and teaches as an adjunct at Wright-Patt Air Force Base. He's the author of several books, including The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and the Political Rivalry since 1979. He joins us from Washington, D.C. I want to just pick up where we left off with Dan and the killing of this latest figure in Iran. Where does that leave the country in terms of leadership right now?
Tim, obviously it's a pretty big news. Ali Larijani is a figure that anybody who's been watching Iran knows has had one or another senior political role for pretty much as long as the Islamic Republic has been around, 47 years. And he most recently returned as the head of the Supreme National Security Council back in August of last year, with the sole job as trying to sort of coordinate best policies as they right after the 12-day war. And now he's gone, most likely, although I haven't seen Iranian official confirmation, but he's probably gone. And I don't think we should underestimate what that means. It's pretty significant, at least a psychological blow. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's quickly replaced. I mean, the regime is still able to put people in senior positions, at least for now. Whether that means that those are the best people they have, or whether it just suggests that they want to show continuity, which is obviously very important for them, from a psychological point of view, to show that they're not on their way out.
Alex, Tim just turned to me and he says it sounds like whack-a-mole. And it does. It feels like as soon as you've reminded us, the regime is not one person, and that as soon as someone's out, they find somebody else. But having said that, not everybody is interchangeable and not everybody is a supreme leader. So I guess I keep wondering, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a video statement that his military is, quote, undermining this regime, meaning Iran, in the hope of giving the Iranian people a chance to remove it. Is it true? Has the regime been undermined? And is this what Iranians want?
Well, Carol, there's no way to deny the fact that the regime is undermined massively. Certainly, it's never been under such amount of attack in its history. And I would also say, Carol, no doubt in my mind that the people of Iran, by and large, really want to see the end of this regime. Obviously, from their point of view, they want the regime to fall with minimum casualties, minimum damage to the country's infrastructure. But the Islamic Republic, in the eyes of many, are a political system that brought one crisis or disaster upon the nation after another, going back to 1979. I mean, they made a host of bad decisions. You could go back to the taking over the U.S. Embassy in November of 1979, provoking Saddam Hussein to attack Iran in September of 80, and I can go on. Look, the regime is weak. It's not on its way out just yet. The big question, and I think that might answer partly what you're asking me, Carol, it's not just that the figures, all of them have to go. The question is, does Israel and the United States perhaps have it in them to accept so-called pragmatic figures from within the regime emerge as possible candidates to take over? That kind of tallies nicely with what President Trump has been suggesting a number of times over the course of this war.
Who are there any of those figures that we know about? Have those figures been identified, Alex? Are there any names of people who might be pragmatic and acceptable to the United States and Israel?
Well, that's a big question mark. I mean, I can give you names, Tim. Let me give you a former president, Hassan Rouhani. For some, he might be just pragmatic enough to be able to change course, take the country in a different direction. Many others would oppose him, say, well, that's not going to solve much. He's been part of this system from day one. So why go through all this trouble just to have someone like him in place? So really, I guess it comes down to how much appetite you have, if you are US, if you are Israel, for this war to continue, to get to a point where you say, I've eliminated all of them. Or you say, well, I don't want to stay here for months and years. I want to have somebody who is sensible enough to compromise, and I will then call it a day and move on.
You know, Alex, one of the things that we keep talking about as we look at this war now in its third week, and it's something that, President Trump said earlier. He talked about the war in Iran. He said that everybody in the world should be thankful, and that if he and his administration had not taken all the steps it has on Iran, including withdrawing the U.S. from the landmark 2015 accord to curb Iran's nuclear program during his first term, that in his words, an, quote, unbelievable nuclear holocaust would have taken place. Is he right? Is this something that actually changes the trajectory of the region, of perhaps Iran's role with the world?
Carol, that's a great question. I mean, that was certainly the motive. That's how the president has tried to sort of, if you will, sell this to the American public. But
is it a sell, or is it maybe right?
Depends. Look, if the regime collapses, in the sense that we can say Islamic Republic is no longer here, is no longer relevant, Iran has moved on, the region will move on, then I would say that's pretty, to end something that's been with us for 50 years in less than a month, that, I know the world is going through an energy crisis, but it's still a significant success. But if the remnants of this regime stay with their thousands of drones and so forth and act like spoilers going forward, then the question becomes, was this the wisest way to do it? Why the timing? Why rush into something? And all sorts of questions can be then asked. But obviously, it's too early to judge. Let's see how long more this war goes on, and what any political transformation, major one, might come out of it.
Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned over the war with Iran. He claimed that Israel had misled President Trump into believing that the regime in Tehran posed an imminent threat. He said, Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation. It's clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. Those are the words of Joe Kent. Is he right that this country posed no imminent threat to the U.S.?
Look, I certainly, as an open source analyst, did not see any Iranian intentions to attack the United States anytime soon. They just didn't have that capacity. But the point is, and obviously, the Israelis sit in a very different part of the world, so they have a very different perspective. They are much closer, and the regime in Tehran for decades vowed to destroy them. So they have a very different sort of sense of threat when it came to the Islamic Republic. Another way of looking at this, Tim, is the Islamic Republic did not do itself any favors going back to 1979, not sort of looking for ways to, if you will, mend ties with the United States after hostage crisis of 79. So again, depends how you measure hostility. The intent was never certainly to be a friend or partner of the United States. Ali Khamenei, the last supreme leader, openly talked about, getting the United States out of the region. So, but did I see an Iranian effort on the way to attack the United States? As I said, I certainly, in my position, did not see that. But I also didn't see them wanted to be friends with the United States, if that makes sense.
Alex Vatanka, thank you so much. Such a go-to for us. Senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in Iran. When we come back, though, we add all this up and get the latest for global energy markets. That's next.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P right now higher by 0.4%. Stock staging a cautious advance. Traders trying to look through the potential implications of higher oil prices. Right now, West Texas Intermediate crude is up 2.4%, 95.77 a barrel. Last hour, we did see a print of 96. Brent, the global benchmark at 103.24, now up by 3%. 0.8%. Again, the S&P holding onto a gain of 0.4. The Dow up 0.3%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 0.5%. The VIX at 22 with a 10-year ahead of tomorrow's Fed decision at 4.19%. The 2-year 3.66%. Gold is at $5,007 the ounce, little changed, up under 0.1%. And again, West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%, $95.82 a barrel. AI data center developer Nebius Group says it intends to raise about $3.75 billion in convertible debt. That's on the heels of a commercial deal with Meta Platforms. Nebius right now down 11.8%, Meta down 0.4%. Qualcomm plans to buy back another $20 billion worth of shares. It's also raising its quarterly cash dividend. Qualcomm shares up 1.9%. Recapping, S&P up 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%, $95.83 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much. Charlie Pellet setting us up so well, taking a look at where we are in terms of the energy trade, WTI and Brent. Both are higher, but we're looking at them definitely off their top levels, highest levels of the session. Having said that, President Trump, he made a lot of comments earlier today from the White House in the Oval Office. He said that as soon as the war is over, oil prices will drop like a rock. He says it won't be long, too, before cargo ships can move through the Strait of Hormuz.
I have a lot of friends from Ireland. They're very happy that I'm getting rid of a nuclear power, a nuclear terrorist. And as soon as that war is over, which will be soon, your prices are going to drop like a rock. You watch.
All right, we will be watching. We are watching. President Trump, of course, earlier today from the White House. As for oil, as we mentioned, it is higher off its best levels of the session, but we do know Iran has continued attacks on energy infrastructure around the Middle East. And then, of course, we talked earlier with our own Dan Williams from Israel, how Israel has killed senior Iranian officials. We want to get another check on the energy markets because the longer this goes on, we think about short-term but also longer-term impacts. Dr. Ellen Wald is back with us, president of Transversal Consulting, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, author of Saudi Inc., once again with us from Boca Raton, Florida. Ellen, is President Trump, first of all, great to have you back. We love talking with you. Is President Trump correct that as soon as the war is over, oil prices will drop like a rock?
Oil prices will definitely drop when the war ends, and it's clear that shipping can resume, but we're not going to return to the previous state of affairs immediately, and that's very clear. First of all, there's going to be a huge backlog. We're going to need to see the stores of various products, crude oil, but also various petroleum products be refilled, and then there's also the damage that's already been done that has to be contended with. For example, Iran landed its first hit to an oil and gas field in the UAE. We don't even know how the extent of the damage, how long it might be offline. When it comes to LNG and natural gas prices in the LNG trade, it's going to take Qatar at least a month to get its facilities back up and running. So there's going to be some long-term reverberations of this. And so while crude oil prices and futures may definitely drop, we're definitely not going to see, return to everything as usual.
Yeah, I'm looking at futures many months out at this point, and we're still, if we go to December of this year, Ellen, for WTI, traders are still betting that's going to be $76.25 per barrel. And that's a price that we hadn't seen in years until earlier this month. So at least the way that traders are thinking about this, they're not looking at this. Either they're not looking at it ending anytime soon, or they're looking at the repercussions of this extending far beyond, quote, dropping like a rock.
Absolutely. I mean, it depends what dropping like a rock means. Does dropping like a rock mean that prices will be back, in the 80s or 70s? Yeah. Does it mean they'll be back? Does it mean we'll see $50 oil, which is what Trump claimed we were going to see right after, the Venezuela, debacle or the Venezuela victory, whatever side you're on. I'm not sure that we're going to see that. We will definitely see a drop simply because the danger presumably will be removed, but the long-term repercussions are going to be felt for a long time. I mean, agriculture, just backlog of products, this is going to take some time to unravel.
So talk to us about those longer-term implications. When you say it's going to take a while, how long, Ellen? Are we talking a few months? Are we talking 6 months? Are we talking a year?
I mean, I think that the markets are incredibly resilient at rerouting things. So I think that we will see markets take the most efficient and best ways to sort things out. But the real test is going to be the extent of the damage. How long is it going to take to get these oil facilities? We don't know how much more is going to be damaged. We're still in the phase of Iran has the capability to destroy and damage oil production in its neighbors. And we don't know how much how much more damage it's going to do. The more damage it does, the longer it will take to to recover from this. So yeah, 6 months, I say, is probably a minimum.
What's more problematic? Some of those other Middle Eastern targets or, oil operations in Iran? And I only bring that up because the president did reiterate that the U.S. could knock out oil on Karg Island, adding that it hasn't done so yet because of how long it would take to rebuild it. Nation previously bombed military targets on the key Iranian export hub, but spared its oil infrastructure. If indeed that happened, what would that do to energy markets short and longer term?
So I think that energy markets are really operating in general without counting for Iranian oil. So if all Iranian oil is off the market, I don't think that that's going to push prices up all that much because, it's really just China that is buying Iranian oil anyway. So, China is probably going to buy more Russian oil to account for a loss in Iranian oil, or it will buy oil from elsewhere. It would be great to have that oil available for the market and also for Iran when it's in some kind of rebuilding stage. But if that oil is off the market, I don't think that is going to have the biggest impact.
Ellen, if we are indeed and we are a net exporter of oil, I think a lot of people have this misconception about what it means to be energy independent when a conflict many thousands of miles away that cuts off 20% supply of the world's oil has such dramatic effect on West Texas Intermediate. Can you explain that connection for people?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, oil is a global commodity and it's priced globally. So even though we don't really import all that much from Persian Gulf countries at the moment, what happens anywhere to oil impacts the price at home. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to see shortages. I don't think we are in danger of seeing shortages of any sort, but because most of the price of gasoline is the price of the barrel of oil, we are impacted by the fact that when prices rise because of any kind of global incident, we are going to feel that at home.
Is there a way, though, for the U.S. to become more energy independent if we do, in the words of the president, drill more here in the United States? Or is the challenge, the oil that we extract here, or the oil that maybe we'll get from Venezuela is not necessarily the oil that we can be using or we can be refining?
Right. I think that the best way to insulate the United States from the kind of price fluctuations that we're seeing is actually to become more oil interdependent. And I think that we do that by strengthening our connections within North America. One of the biggest reasons why we aren't feeling, these impacts beyond just in the price of gasoline and the price of diesel is that we have such a great interface with Canada. Most of our oil imports right now actually come from Canada. And so if we can strengthen our interdependence as part of the North American oil ecosystem, then we are either even better insulated. The other way to do that is to do more refining and to produce more diesel here in the United States, to produce more gasoline. California, for example, can only use gasoline that is produced and refined in California. Well, that needs to change, or California needs to have more refineries. The more that we can have our own refineries, and the more that we can do that, the better insulated we can be from global issues, and also the more we can help assist. We started this war in a sense, and we have the capability to assist other countries that are more impacted by it. And if we produce more at home and we produce more products, we can help other countries more by exporting.
Ellen, you mentioned Canada. I don't know if you've seen any of the stories over the last year, but we're having some troubles with that relationship, certainly with this White House. Having said that, I do think about the administration and how they do think about national security, and that includes energy security. Does this somehow grease the wheels, no pun intended, in terms of that relationship, the U.S. and Canada, to kind of figure out something a little bit more constructive?
I think it absolutely should, because the better relations we can have with Canada, the more ease of transportation of goods, services, but also the things that we need to, build oil infrastructure will be better. Canada really has no choice but to export a lot of its oil through the United States. So the United States technically imports that oil, and then a lot of it is also exported or used in the U.S. Now they do have the option to export, via ports in Vancouver. But the more that we can work with Canada and build more infrastructure and do more exchanges, the better those relations will be, and the more flexibility we'll have in terms of gasoline and energy prices in general.
One distinction I want to make, because we have a great story out on the Bloomberg too, about just reminding us that U.S. diesel rose above $5 a gallon for the first time since December of 2022 because of what we are seeing, the surging oil prices amid the war and disruption in the Middle East. We talk about diesel, its role in freight, agriculture, construction industries, and so everybody's kind of trying to juggle and manage that. What do we need to understand? I mean, we talk about energy as this bucket, but there are different pieces within that bucket.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons the diesel prices are surging is because we didn't have a lot of diesel in storage. And so we haven't had that cushion to kind of fall back on. Whereas in terms of gasoline, we had more in storage. And so we have more cushion to fall back on. But increases in diesel prices are really what reverberates throughout the economy. And that's really where we will see people who aren't buying diesel gasoline might not necessarily feel it at the pump, but diesel is what's used in trucking, it's what's used in construction. And so we will feel those increases in other ways in the economy, increases in grocery prices, for example, and other goods that need to be transported. I mean, our trucking is, I would say, the lifeblood of this country. I mean, everything is transported via trucking, essentially. And so we're going to feel that in the economy in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and I think, Carol, a complicated time, to say the least, for a midterm election.
One would think, right?
For an administration that has been so focused on affordability. Dr. Ellen Wald, always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Ellen Wald is president of Transversal Consulting. She's senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's the author of Saudi Inc.
Quick check on WTI crude. We're still up about 2.8%, $96.14 a barrel. Go on over to Brent, and we're seeing that also trending higher, but off its highs of the session, up about 3.2%. $103.48 a barrel.
Okay, so also looking at the futures curve and looking at months out, it's still above $70 a barrel. So the question is, how much does that drop and how quick does that drop if and when this war ends?
All right, from energy to crypto we go. Stick around.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Oil higher along with stocks. S&P up 20 right now to 67.19, gain there of 0.3%. Wall Street is staging a cautious advance. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.8%, back above 96 now, 96.12 a barrel. Brent crude 103.50. It is up by 3.3%. The Dow up 97, up 0.2%, while Nasdaq is up 104 now. That is a gain of 0.5%. The 10-year 4.20% with a 2-year 3.66%. A Fed decision tomorrow. The VIX now at 22. Spot gold at $5,002 the ounce, down 0.1%. And again, West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.8%, $96.16 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin, meanwhile, up 0.6%, 74,678 on Bitcoin. Mastercard says it will acquire the stablecoin infrastructure startup BVNK for as much as $1.8 billion. That's 4 months after negotiations between BVNK and Coinbase Global for a roughly $2 billion deal fell apart. Mastercard down 0.1%. Coinbase today up now by 4%. Bentley Motors, which is owned by Volkswagen, planning to cut 275 jobs as the British luxury car maker grapples with falling sales in China. Volkswagen ADRs up today by 0.8%. And just getting word that Unilever is considering a separation of its food assets as it looks to streamline its portfolio. Unilever is the parent of such brands as Hellmann's and Knorr. ADRs of Unilever up now by 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellett, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec, live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Hey, surprising perhaps, but true. This is something we've been talking about a lot here at Bloomberg. Bitcoin been somewhat of an oasis of calm relative to the volatility that we've seen certainly in the equity markets, also in gold and oil, with its value pushing through a crucial psychological mark of $75,000, Tim.
Yeah, you look at the chart on the Bloomberg terminal, Bitcoin up about 13% since the U.S. War in Iran began at the beginning of this month, the end of last month. The S&P 500 down about 2% over that same period of time. I want to bring in Monique Mulima. She's Bloomberg News equities reporter. She covers Bitcoin. She joins us from Toronto. Monique, a few weeks ago, if we were talking about the idea of Bitcoin as a safe haven, it was moving in the opposite direction of gold, and now it looks like there's been a little bit of a sell-off in equities and people have been going to Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin earning back that safe haven label?
That's what people in the crypto industry are certainly hoping. We've seen Bitcoin, like you said, it's outperforming gold, it's outperforming equities since the start of the war. And we've seen some investors kind of come back to the crypto industry. It's also important to keep in mind that this is coming after there was a large sell-off in crypto earlier this year and late last year. So some of this is also just Bitcoin regaining some of what it lost earlier and kind of starting to, what some people are saying, hit a bottom for those low prices that we were seeing. So that's bringing investors back to it and people giving it a second look now.
Right. I think I might have said at the top, was it that crypto was up on the year, but it's actually down on the year.
Yeah, Bitcoin
still.
Specifically, right? Down about 15% this year.
Exactly. Even though we've seen it move up since the war began. You know, Monique, I totally get that everybody in the crypto industry wants it to do well. Who's actually buying crypto at this point?
So we are seeing some retail investors come back as people are trying to figure out what's the best way to try and invest at this time of the war. But as a whole, volumes are still considerably down from last year, particularly on some of the larger exchanges. So we're not seeing the same level of crypto investment that we saw a year ago, but there are some people who had kind of gone to the sidelines a bit when the crypto prices really fell last year and are now coming back to the markets.
Hey, just real quickly, CoinDesk reporting Wall Street investment bank Citi lowered its 12-month price targets for Bitcoin, also Ether, and they cited slower legislative momentum in the U.S. That matters more, right, in terms of Bitcoin and actually the crypto market's future. Just quickly.
Yes, that's been a key focus for investors. The market structure bill, people are really hoping to see get passed before midterms because we don't know what the makeup of the government will be post-midterms. But that has been stalled. The industry and the lawmakers are still at odds over some of the rules around stablecoin yield and other factors. And until that bill gets passed, a number of analysts and investors are saying we're not going to see this large breakout in crypto because people really want to see rules come into play.
All right, going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Monique Mulima, she is Bloomberg News equities reporter. We're going to stay in the crypto industry.
Yeah, now to Mastercard, which said it will acquire the stablecoin infrastructure startup BVNK for as much as $1.8 billion. 4 months after negotiations between BVNK and Coinbase fell apart for roughly $2 billion deal. For why and why now, we bring in Bloomberg News consumer finance reporter Paige Smith. She joins us here in the studio. We're going to get to why and why now, but I think for a lot of people might be watching and listening right now, they might have never heard of BVNK until your story early today that crossed the Bloomberg that said this up to $1.8 billion deal was happening. What is it? What are they getting?
That's a very good question. I think it's also important to kind of understand who is actually buying BVNK as well, which is Mastercard. Mastercard is, one of the biggest and most traditional payment networks in the US, and it's an entity that works with a lot of the big banks that we cover every day and talk about day in and day out, but they are acquiring BVNK, this London-based startup that is also really quite young. We were mentioning earlier that it was founded in 2021, and basically what BVNK
So it's 5 years old.
I know. Listen, I would take a 1.8 billion.
It's a mere pre-K.
It's a pre-K.
Exactly, pre-K. But the firm is it's a stablecoin infrastructure company, to answer your question, Tim. So basically what they do is they provide they enable those on-ramps and off-ramps for, say you're someone living in Buenos Aires and you want to, your currency is quite volatile. You want to tap into something that's a little more stable. So you want to tap into stablecoin technology to be able to do that.
Does that kind of make sense? I think I saw a story also on the Bloomberg or somewhere in doing kind of some prep for this, is that Mexico talked about digital transfers beating, I guess, regular traditional cash transfers for the first time or something. So, I mean, it kind of is logical, isn't it?
It definitely is, and similar but different. That was a great story actually done by our colleague Maria Clara earlier today that basically did say that, the digital transfers from specifically, I believe it was U.S. to Mexico, but certainly remittances, and that's definitely something that could be enabled or sped up with stablecoin.
Does it show that Mastercard is moving in a different direction than it has moved? Does it show a change in strategy, or does it say, hey, this is how we think the future is going to roll out? We want to be prepared for it.
I would say the latter, but it's more of a doubling down of strategy that Mastercard had kind of already enunciated. Earlier, I think it actually was last week, Mastercard announced this sort of digital currency, crypto adjacent partnership network that really, it basically speaks to this broader trend, right, of these digital, more traditional financial firms wanting to get in on these emerging technologies, especially in the payment space. So if it may be Mastercard with this payment, with these partnerships, and also now this acquisition today. It's Visa with sort of broader investments and technology developments in as they pertains to stablecoin. But one really important thing to keep in mind is that your credit cards are not going away anytime soon. Consumer payments, especially in the U.S., I think are certainly here to stay. And that's because the banks really like it that way.
They make some decent fees off of these.
They do.
Interchange fees.
And rewards.
Yeah.
I think
Just saying.
Yes.
The infrastructure as it is a lot of people get paid.
Right?
It's alive and well.
Hey, 30 seconds left, Paige. I mean, but how should we think about stable coins kind of changing how money moves around?
That it's much more instant, I would say. Okay. And while some of the players may be changing, I think that this trend of the existing players trying to move in to take advantage of those emerging technologies, that's a trend that's here to stay as well.
All right. Good stuff. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking how hard it was to send from a concert that I went to like 10 years ago. I bought a ticket for my friend. He lived in London. He wanted to pay me back for it, and we just couldn't make it happen.
It's really
He's like, I'll
tricky.
give you money next time I come to the U.S.
It's tricky. Yeah. We had to kind of deal with that when we had a daughter overseas. It's just
easy.
Good old Western Union transfers.
It's tricky. Thank you so much. Paige Smith, Bloomberg News consumer finance reporter, right here in studio. Hey, when we come back, we're going to take a look at stocks on the move. Stick around.